Greetings, fellow Trekkies and Trekkers, and welcome to my first video in my series called Remembering Star Trek. Today, I'm going to talk about the show that started it all, Star Trek, the original series. Now, what's interesting about this show is that it lasted only 3 seasons from 1966 to 1969, and as some people have pointed out before in the past, 1966 is infamous because that year was the birth of the fanboy with the introduction of 2 shows, the Adam West Batman show and Star Trek the original series. Now, why am I calling the show Star Trek the original series and not just Star Trek? Well, it's mainly because I want to differentiate this show from the movie that came out in 2009 that was just called Star Trek. So there you go. Yeah, so how did I get into the show? How was I introduced to it? It was basically through VHS tapes that my dad had. He had actually recorded several episodes of the original series on video. And when I found this out, I was just blown away by that. I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So I would watch some of those recorded episodes with him when I would stay with him over the weekend, and I would love them. I would love watching them with him, asking him all these different questions and stuff like that. And then eventually I got the first 2 seasons on DVD. Now all the shows are available to watch on Netflix, and I'm lucky enough to have a Netflix account, and I have all the Star Trek shows on my Netflix queue or whatever it's called. So basically, I could just go ahead and watch the shows whenever I want, which is really great. And I applaud the people at Netflix for doing that, especially because this year, 2016, marks Star Trek's 50th birthday, which is so crazy because back in 2013, Doctor Who celebrated its 50th anniversary, and now Star Trek is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and I'm really excited, and I'm proud of that, so there you go. Okay, so now let's get down to the nitty-gritty, and let's talk about my favorite episodes, as well as the essential episodes that you should definitely watch from the original series. Okay, starting with The Cage. This is actually the very first pilot episode of this show, and it was basically a trial run for us to how the show was going to be. Unfortunately, there are a lot of differences between what happens in this episode and what's going on in the show itself. First of all, there is no Captain Kirk. Instead, it's Christopher Pike, who was the captain of the Enterprise. Spock, they were still trying to develop his character, so in some scenes you could see him smiling and whatnot. And also, the first officer, or number 1, was female, which was something that I thought was kind of interesting. But of course, this was during the 1960s and stuff like that, so there was still some sexism going on and whatnot, and apparently the networks didn't really like that, so they changed that, and I think as of now, the only female first officer that we've ever seen in a Star Trek show has been T'Pol from Enterprise, which came out all the way back in 2001, and it still just boggles my mind that that's the only Star Trek show in which one of the main characters was in which they had a female first officer, and that's just, I seriously don't know why they couldn't have done that in any of the other shows, but whatever. So there you go. Alright, next up, Where No Man Has Gone Before. Now this is the second pilot episode, and it was basically like the second trial run, like, okay, so let's fix some of the problems that we had with the first pilot and try to make things different. And so they got William Shatner as Kirk. Spock still does some smiling and stuff like that. Again, they were trying to. They were trying to. They were still in the early stages of trying to figure out who Spock is and stuff like that. So there you go. But yeah, still, if you want to see what Star Trek could have been, then definitely watch The Cage. But if you want more of a sense of what was going on in the original series, then definitely watch Where No Man Has Gone Before, okay? Next up, The Man Trap. This is the very first episode of the original series. Unfortunately, I think it was like the 5th or 6th episode that they filmed, yet they showed this one first. I don't know why they did this, but it was kind of a weird thing back in the 60s. Like, they would show episodes out of order, which is kind of weird, but if you have the show on DVD, then, and you can find out the actual production order of the episodes, you can just watch them in production order, or you can just watch them in episodic order, or whatever. So, there you go. But still, this episode is very interesting. It's kind of, it has kind of a Monster of the Week type thing going on. But other than that, it's a great episode. And like I said, it was the first one to air. So there you go. The Naked Time. This episode is basically kind of a very silly, goofy episode. Basically what happens is that the Enterprise crew, they get infected by this virus, and it makes them lose all their inhibitions and stuff. And this episode is well known for having the scene where Sulu, played by George Takei, is shirtless, and he's running around, and he's got this fencing blade and stuff like that. It's just very, very silly. And on top of all that, in The Next Generation, there was actually a sequel. They made a sequel to this very episode. So, yeah, I'll definitely talk about that when I talk about Star Trek Next Generation, so there you go. Next up, The Menagerie. Now, this episode is well known because it was the first two-parter of the original series. I think it was like the only two-parter of the original series. And this episode is extremely essential because this episode harkens back to the events of The Cage, which I thought was really great, and I love that. It's a very good episode, and I really enjoy it. And it's definitely one that you should definitely check out. Balance of Terror. This episode is extremely, extremely essential for two very good reasons. The first reason is that this episode marks the very first appearance of the Romulans, who have been pretty much antagonists of the Federation for a really long time. However, in this episode, this is the first time we actually get to see them on screen, which is great. And the second reason why this episode is absolutely essential is because this episode marks the very first on-screen appearance of Mark Lenard, who will then go on to play Spock's father, Sarek, in an episode that I'm going to talk about in this video, in an episode of the animated series, and then again in Next Generation. And this episode is crucial. If you're a fan of Mark Lenard, if you love the Romulans, then this episode you should definitely watch, without a doubt. So there you go. Shore Leave. Now, this is a very silly, wacky episode. It's basically an episode where the crew of the Enterprise, they go down and they visit this this amusement-themed planet, and has all these wacky, silly things going on. They make references to Alice in Wonderland and whatnot. And again, it's a very silly, goofy episode, but I love it, and I always laugh every single time I watch this episode. So there you go. Space Seed. Now this is again a very, 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 very essential episode, because this episode serves as the inspiration for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. So if you want to know, so if you want to see Ricardo Montalban's first on-screen appearance as Khan, watch this episode and you'll be all set up and you'll be all ready to watch Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. If you're having a Star Trek movie marathon, and after you're done watching Star Trek The Motion Picture, watch Space Seed first, and then watch Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. So, there you go. City on the Edge of Forever. Now this episode I love for a variety of reasons, and this is my all-time favorite episode of the original series for a variety of reasons. Reason number one, it's a time travel episode, and reason number two, this episode deals with preventing, I guess you could say, a fixed moment in time, or something in time that was supposed to happen, but it ends up happening differently, which is kind of what they do somewhat on Doctor Who. I mean, the only episode in which they actually dealt with preventing or stopping a fixed point in time was the wedding of River Song. That was the only time that ever happened. However, this episode, it basically talks about the dangers of time travel, which, again, we've seen in many other instances before, again, with Doctor Who, with Back to the Future movies, but still, this episode does it brilliantly, and I absolutely love it. It's my all-time favorite episode of the original series, and I love it, so there you go. Amok Time. Now, this episode is crucial, and this episode is very essential / crucial for a number of reasons. Reason number one, this is the first time we get to go to Spock's homeworld of Vulcan. Reason number two, this is the first time Spock does the live long and prosper salute. This is the first time we get to see that on screen. And this episode is also essential because this episode marks the very first appearance of Pavel Chekhov, played by Walter Koenig. And there's a very interesting continuity error that I'll talk about when I talk about Star Trek II. So there you go. Be on the lookout for that. Mirror, Mirror. This episode marks the first time that we go to the Mirror universe, and they've done this before a couple times in Star Trek Deep Space Nine and then in Star Trek Enterprise, but it was never done in Next Generation or in Voyager. It only happened in the original series, Deep Space Nine and Enterprise. That's it. So if you want to see the first Mirror Universe episode, definitely watch this episode. You will not be disappointed, and I love it. Journey to Babel. This episode is extremely essential because this is the first time we get to meet Spock's parents. Sarek, played by the aforementioned Mark Lenard, and Amanda Grayson, played by Jane Wyatt, who only shows up one other time in the franchise, and that was in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. So if you want to see Jane Wyatt's first appearance as Amanda Grayson, then definitely watch this episode. It is awesome. I love it, and you will love it just as much as I do. So there you go. The Trouble with Tribbles. This, again, is a very silly, goofy episode. I absolutely love it. And there was an episode of Deep Space Nine, in which I'll talk about when I get to that show, in which some of the characters go back to the events of this particular episode. And I love that. It's great. But again, Trouble with Tribbles, very silly, goofy episode. But again, it's kind of silly and goofy that I like. So, there you go. The Enterprise Incident. This is the episode in which Kirk gets surgically altered to look like a Romulan in order to steal a cloaking device. Yes, apparently the Romulans were, I guess, the first species in Star Trek to get their hands on cloaking device technology, and so Kirk steals it, and they actually install it in the Enterprise, and that was kind of interesting. But of course, starships having cloaking device technology wouldn't actually happen until much later. I think it didn't happen again. I think it actually happened in Deep Space Nine, but of course, correct me if I'm wrong about that. So there you go. Plato's Stepchildren. Now, this episode is very essential because this episode marks the first interracial kiss in Star Trek between Kirk and Uhura. Yes, that is when that happened. Some people say it happened in another episode where Kirk kissed someone else of a different race, but still, this episode, very crucial because that was the first time that there was an interracial kiss on Star Trek. So, there you go. Let that be your last battlefield. Now, this episode is well known for dealing with topics of racism. Again, I'm not quite sure if that was the case for that in that episode, but still, it's very interesting. But still, yeah, racism was a very hot topic back in the 60s, especially because of the civil rights movement that was going on. So if you want to see Star Trek deal with that topic, then definitely watch that episode. So there you go. And last but not least, Turnabout Intruder. This is the very last episode of the original series. Is it a good finale? No, not really. It's definitely not as good as some of the other finales, but still, this episode was the very last one. And again, it's kind of silly and goofy, but yeah, it basically deals with this alien woman switching bodies with Kirk. That's it. That's basically the bulk of the episode, and they're trying to and Kirk's trying to get back to his body any way he possibly can. So, yeah, so again, very silly, weird sci-fi shenanigans, but again, it was the very last episode of the original series, and it's still a very entertaining episode to watch. Okay, so there you go. So that concludes my first video in remembering Star Trek. Now, next week, I know some of you guys are thinking that I'll probably just go ahead and talk about Star Trek Next Generation, right? No, instead, next week, I will be talking about the only Star Trek show that no one ever talks about. A lot of people talk about the live action shows, but there's one entry that no one ever talks about, and I will be talking about it next week, and that will be Star Trek the Animated Series. So, yeah, so anyway, that is what will be happening next week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until then, live long and prosper.